When you
Probably.
look back at the time you've spent leading a church, what do you hope people say about you?
I hope when I'm done, people will say he loved us. Because I think if nothing else people get out of my ministry than experiencing the love of Christ by something I said or did.
Yeah. Well, Mike, I'm really excited today to get this chance to have this conversation. But I've been thinking about it quite a bit since we had our last conversation. You kind of told me about how you got started in ministry, and I was so intrigued by that because it's so different than what I have experienced in the past. Not having started ministry until I was 35.
Right.
I didn't even get saved till I was 25. And that's when you started full-time ministry. That's just crazy. So maybe you could take a few minutes and talk about your call to ministry. I mean, how did that happen? What was going on at that time in your life? How old were you and where were you at in life? And how did it take place?
I grew up in the church. As one of the kids, I was probably in church my first week of life. As soon as it was safe to bring me to church, my parents probably brought me to church. And there's no point in my life where I don't remember that we weren't in church nearly every Sunday. And probably starting in my elementary years, it was more than once or twice a week.
Yeah.
My parents were super, super involved. My parents work for what was then Campus Crusade for Christ. Now it's Cru. But so just sort of Christian ministry, it's sort of the DNA in which I grew up in. It's just the water I swam in. And so I was at church a lot. And as I sort of became aware of thinking about future things, probably 15 was when I really first started considering anything beyond the moment of what I was in. I had a pastor challenge me to really start taking seriously my faith in Jesus, and so it was at that point he basically said, "Put up or shut up." He said, "You're either in or you're out. Don't be like just sort of in between stuff." He didn't use the Revelation language, although it's pretty appropriate, right? Don't be hot or cold, but don't be wishy-washy.
Which you can do with a 16-year-old.
Yeah. And so I remember taking that seriously, and that's when I started taking my faith seriously enough and getting even more involved in church. At least as a teen, I had more opportunities. So by the time I was 17, I was serving in every possible way I could as a 17-year-old in the church. I was there probably, I won't say 7 days a week. It was 5 days a week at least, through various different things, not just for services, but, we did prayer, I think 3 days a week at the church. And so I was there 3 days a week at like 6 a.m. and sang on a worship team, did discipleship. I was a discipleship leader. I was an evangelism explosion leader. I don't know if you remember evangelism explosion, but I did that. Like I said, sang on the worship team for my youth group. So just a lot of stuff.
How did you feel about that? Was that like a fulfilling thing, or did you feel
I loved it
at times like these people own me?
No, I never. Nobody asked me. I mean, I was asked to be a part of these things, but nobody told me I had to. Nobody said this is necessary for your Christian. It wasn't like I was forced to do anything. It was I wanted to do more and more and more. Wow. So when I was 17, I was doing everything I could, and I felt a very deep discomfort, like deep unsettling about my Christian life. And it wasn't a sin. It was you're not doing enough, which is strange because I was doing, like I said, everything I could. Like I felt it's a disconnect. I don't even know how to describe it. Just very deep unsettling. And it was unsettling because I'm sitting there looking around, going, I don't know what else to do. Like I feel like I'm committed to Jesus. I feel like I'm doing everything that I know how to do, right? As a leader and as a disciple, right? To do this. And so I spent, 6-8 months in. It was almost a fear, like it was brokenness, because I'd go up to the altar and I'd cry because I'm just like, I don't know, God. Like, wow. It felt vastly unfair, but it as it turns out, I didn't know what I was hearing. I resonate very, very much with the call of Samuel. Samuel's sitting in the temple, right, and he's hearing the voice of God, and he's going to Eli, going, "What are you saying?" Like, because he hasn't recognized what God is saying to him. Yeah. And finally, Eli says, it takes Eli 3 times, right? Like, the kid's not silly. He's hearing God. And so I had somebody in my life. It was just one day I was praying, and that person said, I think I know what God is calling you to, but there's no way. He's like, there's no way I can tell you that. I can't be God.
Did this person have a position of authority in your life?
So he was a leader in our youth group. He was actually the brother of our youth pastor, a pastor in his own right. He's ordained, and has since gone on and he leads a church, I think, even now. He just said, but I don't feel like it's my place to tell you what God is telling you. Like, this is one of the things that if you have to hear it from God first, otherwise it's going to be. And so he basically said, go back to bed, right? Like Eli says to Samuel, go back to bed. If the voice comes again, right, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So he just said, just listen. And he said, when you think you have it figured out, I mean, it was kind of this idea that God is faithful, God will reveal it to you, you'll get it one of these days. So obviously the discomfort didn't go away, but sort of the tenor of how I dealt with it did. It's like, okay, someone else is recognizing what's going on, and it's a matter of listening. I mean, it ticked me off the time that he said, I won't tell you, because he kind of, in my mind, he's laughing because he knows, and it's not a bad thing, right? It's a very joyful thing for him to be like, I recognize the naivete in you, and so.
Well, you've been in that position with other people now, too.
Yeah.
You know what it feels like on the other side.
Right. So, there's people you go, that person probably called the ministry, but I can't be God.
Yeah.
Right. I can encourage and I can give opportunities, but unless they hear from God, it's right. That's something you have to hear first and then have confirmed versus the other way around. At least that's how I see it. And so it took another 6-8 months, and it wasn't like, again, it wasn't an epiphany that happened. It was just kind of I call it a slow dawning. It was just like sunrise. I don't know when it happened, but it happened. Like all of a sudden it was there.
Yeah.
And so, I went back to that leader and I said, I think God's calling me into like vocational ministry, not just full-time. I was in full-time ministry already. Like I was doing it. That was part of my life. It was what my life was. But I said, I think, God wants me to do this as a vocation, as a job, as well as sort of my calling to be and make disciples.
And you know what that meant.
Yeah.
That meant,
so
I'm going to school.
So for me, that meant, I need to get education. I need to be ordained. I need to go through the process. And, some people get that at 35. Some people get it it happened at 17 to me, where it was just, this is it. And there was a fairly clear path. Yeah. In our denomination, there's a lot of good schools that you can go do that, get ordained. And so that's kind of how it went. And from then it was just sort of, it wasn't what am I going to do? It's just how I'm going to get there.
Yeah. And so how long was that period of time between when you started Bible college and you finished seminary?
So I did a 4-year undergraduate degree at Northwest Nazarene University in religion, and then a 3-year graduate degree at Nazarene Theological Seminary. So 7 years.
So you got this call. Mm-hmm. 7 years later, you graduate. What happens then?
So I graduated from seminary, and I just sent within the Church of Nazarene, I said, I don't want to go anywhere east of the Mississippi. There's lots of reasons behind that, but just I felt culturally I'm a Western person. I was born in California, raised in Colorado, schooled in Idaho, and so Kansas City was where I went to graduate school, was the furthest east I had been for longer than a vacation amount of time, and so the culture in the United States varies greatly across region, and I felt that I was sort of Western in my heart. Yeah. So I sent my resume everywhere west of the Mississippi, to every Nazarene district west of the Mississippi. So, and ended up getting a job as far west from the Mississippi as you can go in the United States. Well, no, Hawaii. It depends on where you mark it, but I went to Alaska. So if you
how
count,
did you feel about that? Were you excited about?
Yeah, I was
starting.
Excited. Oh yeah, I was excited and nervous. So again, I spent from 17 until 25 going, I need to get this done. I need to meet these requirements so that I can go do ministry full time, right? So that I can be in a church full time. Because you can't do that.
You were married.
Yeah, got married right out of college. So I graduated college, and then the next December I got married.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's you and your wife going to Alaska.
Yeah, and initially it worried me because she said, I'd like to go anywhere but Alaska. She said that. She specifically said, I don't want to go to Alaska. That was early on, and once it got there, it became something that she was okay with. Yeah. Because I brought that up to her when I was like, I got this call from this superintendent in Alaska. She's like, oh, okay, I trust you. That's what she said.
You're 25.
Mm-hmm.
You spent the last 7 years
Mm-hmm.
learning how to navigate the Bible and communicate it, and
Yeah.
maybe a little bit of administrative stuff. But
Very
back
little.
then, there was not much about how to pastor a church. It was mostly how to understand the Bible and teach it,
Yeah, I mean,
do it the right way.
Yeah, so seminary is difficult because, and actually, I had a conversation with the president of the seminary about that after. He visited me, I don't know, a couple years into my ministry and just said, hey, what can we do better? And I was just talking about that idea, and he said, we only have such amount of time that like there's no way we can fit everything in and still have it. At the time, the seminaries, they were requiring the maximum amount of hours you could require for a graduate degree. So 90 credit, it was a lot.
Because they knew it too.
Yeah. And, seminary is not necessarily designed for people who are coming out of, so I had undergrad. I could have been ordained out of undergrad, but I wanted to get more education and more context. And so I had much more than a lot of people who went. So you're talking, you have 3 years to get people to, the whole breadth of the stuff that I learned the 4 years before. And so, but yeah, there's not a whole lot of practice, not a whole lot of like, this is how you do it, other than sort of, you have internships. But at the time, it's a little bit different now, but at the time it's a lot of, we want to make sure your theology is right, which is good. You got to have good theology. You want to make sure you know how to study the Bible, and you want to interpret the Bible well. You want to make sure, I took biblical languages, all sorts of stuff like a lot of theology, a lot of history. And so there was a few administrative classes, but the churches being what they are, some are big, some are small.
Yeah.
And so I took a class in multiple staff ministry, but I went to a church where it was just me. And that's a very different context.
What a shock it must have been. I know because I planted a church.
Yeah.
There is so much adrenaline the first 3 years. You run on adrenaline at first because it's so exciting because you're actually getting to do the thing that you've always wanted to do.
Right. But what was difficult for me is I sit down and I go, well, all the stuff I want to do, like I want to parse theology and I want to talk theology. That's not necessarily where everybody is. That informs. That it should inform your practice, it should inform your preaching, it should inform everything you do, and your leadership, your administration, all that stuff. But it's not necessarily something that people as a whole like to sit down and discuss.
It's a very small part of what church life is really about.
So it's how do I help my people? How do I help people get from, or just how do I integrate this theology into everything I do so that people are learning it without let's sit down and talk about, I don't know, Torture in the Eucharist by William Cavanaugh. There would be 4 people in the church who would do that, but it wouldn't be a Sunday sermon series, right? So navigating that bridge for me, I sat down the first week. I remember my first day, I just kind of sat down. I was staring at the wall going, what do I do now? Like, I know I have a sermon to get done. And that takes a lot of research, and I would, 15, 20 hours at first every week on my sermon, but like, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
When I moved here, I was expecting it to be like Alaska, and I'm sitting in my office and there are just people streaming through the office all day long. Like all day long. There's people coming in, coming out, popping in my office saying hello. And I'm like, Alaska, largely speaking, you have people who work, and we lived in sort of best way of putting it is a suburb of Anchorage. A lot of people work in Anchorage. It's expensive to live there, so it's two income families. So there's very few people who are just kind of like out and about and like, hey, I'd like to stop in. And people don't retire in Alaska, generally speaking. And so you don't have people who are retired, that's the people who popped into my office when I first got here. It was like, oh, okay, wonderful. Like, these great people, and they're working in the church, and I don't have to ask them to do anything, and they're just doing it, and they're trimming the hedges and mowing the lawn, and that's wonderful. Yeah. I didn't have that in Alaska, just because it's a completely different context with completely different age group dynamics. And so I'm kind of there's a list of 4 people maybe I could visit who are home, who aren't working right now, or homeschooling their kids or whatever it might be. It was so working that out and trying to figure out the relational aspect of pastoring was the hard part for me. Because even in my internships, I did an internship. I preached every week for a year and a half in seminary. I was functionally the pastor of the church. I would call myself the preacher. I don't know that I didn't pastor the church, but so that part was like I had the habits of that. But it's the the relational part that I was like, oh, this is different. And there's
Yeah,
different
very
skills
different.
you have to develop that I didn't have time to do when I was in seminary. I was going to school full time, working at least 30 hours a week, and then trying to pastor a church. And so that's right. There's only so much people expect from you when that's going on. And there's only so much you can do relationally.
Yeah.
So that's the thing in Alaska that's really difficult, like that transition of like, oh, I've got to do this now. And it's the old trope. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, right?
Yeah.
I've said that even when I was in seminary, but it kind of became real. So, oh yeah, that's like, there's a relational aspect here that was a hard lesson for me to learn.
What was it like coming to Longview? Was it a different culture, obviously?
Yeah, definitely. So Alaska's sort of this fiercely independent, and Eagle River especially. I mean, you're a suburb of Anchorage. Most people are professionals. There's not a whole lot of laborers. I mean, we had a few who worked for the railroad, but professionals, busy, driven, who have a level of education, right? So, but even speaking to people, like, I mean, that's pastoring, learning to speak these truth of the Bible or truth of theology, talking about God in ways that are appropriate and hearable by the people we're talking to. So it's a different group of people where it's, Longview's less professional.
Yeah.
At least my church was less professional. A lot of laborers. I went from a lot of young families. So most of the families in my church in Alaska were my age. We had, this group of 5 or 6 that were, we all had kids at the same time. Our kids were all the same age. We did stuff together because we were the same age. So I was pastoring largely contemporary. I mean, there were some older and younger, but largely people of my contemporary age. Longview, I moved to a church that was predominantly retired. I don't think there was anybody my age. In fact, it's pretty close that there still isn't. There's a couple now, but in my church. And so now I'm learning how do I pastor folks who are older than me, who are retired, who have much more water under the bridge, much more wisdom, and much more experience. I'm talking about the things of God to people in their 90s who have been hearing about the things of God since they were in their,
Yeah.
I have somebody right now in my church who's they're in their mid 80s, mid 80s, who were founding members of my church.
Wow.
So they've been around since 1952, and I'm like, now I'm preaching these things to them and talking theology to people who have had some really, really good people teaching them, and really great people in the community, and so just it's a different context. Moving from a place that's so isolated. I mean, Alaska is isolated. Anchorage it's a big city, but it's still isolated from the lower 48, and so just sort of the interactions you have are different. It's a different culture.
Yeah. How do you look at challenges now after 17 years in ministry? How do you approach challenges?
So anything that happens in the church that it's a challenge, I own and I take personal responsibility for, whether or not it's my personal responsibility.
Which not everyone does.
Right. I have a very high sense of responsibility and a very, this is good and bad, but sort of this active sense of, I'm the leader, I'm the pastor here, and so whatever happens is in some way, like sort of the buck stops here type of idea.
Yeah. So at some point, this is all going to stop. You'll stop doing ministry.
Yeah, probably.
When you look back at the time you've spent leading a church, what do you hope people say about you?
I hope when I'm done, people will say he loved us. Because I think if nothing else people get out of my ministry than experiencing the love of Christ by something I said or did.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just the environment we're in with so many scandals in the church with pastoral failings and things like that, or pastoral abuse or spiritual abuse. I mean, all that sort of thing I hope people come away knowing that I love them.
Yeah.
And that hope, and again, that love was motivated and based in, this is just a taste of the love of Jesus for us.
I could pastor in the same city with you for years and years and years and years and never know who you really are. And so I just appreciate, for one, I appreciate the fact that you're actually a leader here and lead in Longview, Kelso, because I think the city's better because of it, the region's better because of it. But plus, On top of that, I appreciate the fact that I have the opportunity to walk alongside you and lead with you. And it's such an honor to be serving in ministry with you, Mike. I'm really glad you're here, and I really appreciate the time you spent with us today. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.